I went to pubs that I knew where people were, the people that if they stopped, they would die, because that justified my drink for when I'm not as bad as them. But it meant that I was just so isolated. I thought I was an extrovert that became an introvert. I thought I'd just grown up and I just thought that this is how life was. I was comfortable in the misery. I was a 99% atheist, 1% agnostic, where I came to this point of there has to be another side to this. Suddenly I just had this feeling that I've never had before in my life, and I've never had it since. And then I was like, right, okay, there is something here. I've got a really great relationship with my son, and I'm present for him. A God of my understanding that I know that's going to look out for me.
Hello and welcome to 12 Steps and 12 Questions. My name is Silvio and I'm an addict. This pod is full of personal and inspirational stories of recovery from addiction. And in every episode I'll ask each guest the same 12 questions about their life, addiction and recovery. Quick warning, there will be some graphic descriptions and a healthy amount of swearing. For this episode, please welcome Luke. Hi fellow 12 Steppers. Thank you for tuning into this New Year's episode of 12 Steps and 12 Questions. First of all, I wish you a happy, healthy, sober and abstinent 2025. To my amazement, this is our 50th episode and I'm deeply touched and grateful to everyone who's listened and liked this pod. Now, recovery is all about connection and community. And so there's a brand new Insta and Facebook page for 12 Steps and 12 Questions to make it easier for the message of recovery to be found. Please come and join us. The more, the merrier. All links are in the show notes. Now to our guest for today, Luke. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Silvio. My name's Luke and I'm an addict. I am a grateful member of CA. My home group is in Bridgewater in Somerset and my sobriety date is July 7th, 2020.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Luke. Let's get straight to it. Our first question of the 12 questions I ask every guest on this pod is, did you have any adverse childhood experiences?
I thought about this and I wouldn't say that there were any kind of particular events. I grew up in a family that was there were four of us, but we were all very separate people and I didn't want for anything materialistically. I remember being very angry and quite sad a lot of the time, which I later realised it was my hole in the soul. One thing I think I only really found out in rehab that really affected my childhood and how I responded to the world was I was bullied for quite a long time, particularly in secondary school. And it stopped because I realised that I suddenly realised I could fight back. All this anger that I had that was coming across when I played sports and this aggression, I turned on the bullies and I suddenly felt I had a lot of respect from everyone else and it all stopped and I thought that's where it ended. But it was only when I got into rehab that I really realised how that had shaped how I viewed people, how I responded to people. I would mask myself with humour. I didn't want to let anyone in just in case they would, I don't want to say bully me, but I don't know, realise something that, I don't know, I guess trigger me.
Hurt you in some way, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. I just didn't want to be hurt anymore. And I found through humour and through, or I cut people out. Would be another thing. I'd quite quickly, through just be really angry and just sort of cut them out. And that was how I approached life. And I didn't realise until I actually got into the rooms that, or got into rehab and got into the rooms, just how that had shaped me. But in terms of my childhood, I think my first addiction really was fantasy matched with music. I'd sort of lose myself. That really helped me. And I would, there was a lot of anger in our house, and but I was able to sort of escape with that, with just being able to just be in my room, play music, and not have to engage really, I guess, with life.
It's interesting what you're saying, and it I'm not really surprised anymore, but I always welcome it when I see and hear how much overlap there is between experiences that either I have had or that I know from sponsees and other fellows in the rooms and my guests on this show, bullying is a huge topic. And if you don't mind, let's just go into it a little bit. I remember there was a time in my life around, gosh, how old was I then? Maybe around sort of 9, 10, 11 or so, I would say, where I got bullied quite badly. And it took, changing class and sort of circle of people within school for that to change. And it affected me deeply. How long did that go on for you? And what age were you then?
So I would say it started in my primary school, towards the end of my primary school. And it wasn't actually in school, it was in, I think it was Cubs or Scouts, and I ended up having to move because of it. It just got too much. It started to get physical at that point. And then when I got into secondary school, it kind of, I had a very small group of friends, a core group of friends. There was about 4 of us. And it was the upper year, and I can remember it, it got very physical at times. And it reached a point where I snapped back. I think I was about sort of 15, and I said, right, okay, let's I think it was like this arranged fight. And I didn't realise how many people had sort of shown up, and I just let all of that rage out. And but it's interesting because it was about the time that around sort of 14, 15, that I'd suddenly discovered alcohol, and being one of the only people that could get alcohol, suddenly I had a lot more friends than I did. I could buy alcohol for other people. So this kind of confidence of people liking me, and actually, because I wasn't the only person that was bullied. I felt this kind of, I sort of I guess I'll just remember channeling it, and suddenly it all changed. And I thought that after that, that the bullying hadn't affected me. But I just remember it was around about sort of 15 times. Everything was kind of happening in terms of I was getting more friends. I was, very active in sport, and my confidence was kind of growing. And alcohol gave me that confidence as well. I would admit that. But it's amazing just how, and I keep reminding myself that wasn't the reason that I'm an addict.
No,
I'm an addict because I'm an addict. But some of these experiences have shaped how I have viewed the world. Definitely how I have behaved in the world. And I think you are right. There's so much overlap when we look at that, and I hear people's stories, and I just, I may not have had the same experience as you, but I can certainly relate, and I can certainly see how you can end up in certain positions.
Now, being bullied at the time, so I wasn't really beaten up much because I was quite happy to fight back and just and defend myself, but not always successfully. But I did defend myself, and it did, however. It involved a lot of sort of psychological stuff, I suppose one would say. People saying nasty things about me, using offensive language, and just being made to feel worthless and less than. And that is something I can, if I remember, go there. If I remember it, if I remember those situations, I can tune into quite easily. And it certainly reinforced my sense of not being good enough, of worthlessness, of being less than, and all of those sort of things. Is that what it triggered in you as well, or was it a slightly different experience for you?
It was, definitely. I had the feeling of uselessness, or the feeling of uselessness, worthlessness. I had such low self-esteem. I can remember. I can remember when, after school and chatting on MSN, and I couldn't believe that people wanted to talk to me. had that feeling of like, you know, I can't believe you actually want to communicate with me outside of, you know, and it's kind of a weird form of gratitude, I guess.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to be me. I felt that what they were saying was true. And the problem is it was kind of a snowball effect that I would react. I think I always got told, well, don't react. And it's like, well, am I going to just let this happen? You know, I just didn't know what to do. So I thought, well, it must be me. You know, you're saying don't react. When I don't react, it happens. When I do react, it gets worse. So there must be something wrong with me. And I carried that for a long time. And I think, you know, I think I could probably even now get a bit like that. I don't know at what point my addiction, the crossover between what my experience and my addiction has caused this low self-esteem.
It's, I suppose, one of those invisible lines we'll never really quite know. It's not an exact science, is it? You know, it's not maths, you know, where one thing then leads to another and in which way. I think low self-esteem and low self-worth, because of bullying in particular, is something that a lot of people experience, and they don't necessarily become addicts. So, as you quite rightly said, while it is an important feature of our makeup and has certainly fueled our addiction, it's not the sort of root cause of it. You sort of alluded to it a little bit earlier, that alcohol became the solution, quote unquote, for this problem. The problem of being bullied and the way you felt about it. And that dovetails quite nicely with our question 2, which is, what did the moment you first got hooked, what did the fun times look like?
So I can remember, my first addiction, I guess, was, or the first time that I took anything was smoking weed when I was, I think, 13. And I remember that feeling of relief. I'd felt sad for such a long time, but finally I wasn't overthinking anything, and I could just I felt, in a sense, apathetic for the first time. And the noise had just started to stop, and it was fun. And, you know, and then came the alcohol, which gave me the confidence just to, you know, and the people, and hanging around with different people, and it just gave me this kind of confidence. And I think those two combined led me to party more, be around more people. That I mean, I joke about this in my shares, that my first spiritual experience happened in Pilton in front of a sound system, taking pills for the first time and discovering drum and bass. And that's been a love affair that I've had even to this day. And I had finally that euphoria, and it felt like, you know, my identity had been sealed in that point. You know, people would, you know, I looked old enough to buy the alcohol. And I can remember times when I would be joking with the bouncers and vouching for people as they came. I was like, don't worry, they're with me, you know. And you know, and you know, I'd hang around with older people, and it was fun up until, you know, even when I moved to Brighton when I was 18. I didn't do very well at college, and my choices were, well, I thought I was going to have to join the army, because I thought, you know, what else could I really do? I was kind of just this. I hadn't done very well in my exams, and I kept being told all throughout school, in fact, you know, if you just apply yourself, if you just did this, if you just did that, you could, you know, the potential. And I thought, right, well, you know, maybe the army will sort me out. Maybe I can realize my potential there. And then it was an ex-girlfriend actually said, oh, you know, I remember it being the summer. It was the early part of the summer of, you know, I hadn't quite got my exam results, but I knew they were going to be terrible. And it was an ex-girlfriend that said, my sister goes to a music college in Brighton. So I was like, you know, she said, you play bass. And I'd kind of, you know, this part of my, you know, I'd learned to play bass through learning songs by listening and just sort of pretending that I was in part of these bands. You know, this was the whole fantasy with music, with my kind of escape. And suddenly, you know, faced with the choice of the army or study music in Brighton, it was quite an easy choice, to be honest. And I remember going down there for my audition, and it was incredibly sunny. I was a vegetarian at the time, and the first pub that I went into was a vegetarian pub, and I thought, this is it. You know, everyone was really happy. It was, you know, I was down by the seaside, and I moved there, and I would say that I had some incredible times there, and I've been really reflecting on it recently, that I had different pockets of friends that were into different sorts of music, and you know, there was all the parties, there were like instruments, and we'd be jamming, or there'd be decks, and you know, and it was, you know, it was just, it was really, it was fun, you know. But I think recently I've been looking back on it, and I've been listening to a lot of the songs that I used to listen to that bring up a lot of those memories, and I don't want the drugs anymore. But actually, it was, you know, to an extent it enhanced it, but really it was kind of like, it was really the music and the people that I really enjoyed with them, and the connection. The drugs did give you that connection. You know, we've all had it. You know, especially even on a Sunday after a full weekend of partying, you're there, and it's just kind of like you're still, you know, the weed and the ketamine comes out just to kind of bring you down, and but you're still having a laugh. You know, still, you know.
Would you describe your using as problematic at this point? Or, because, you know, I'm sure that if we talk to a few non-addicts, they will say not dissimilar things, you know. So if we talk about heavy drinkers or heavy users who are not addicts, you know, they'd go, oh, I had a great time in college, you know, and you know, we'd be doing this, that, and the other, and so on. And they, for one reason or another, move on from that, you know, when we didn't, right? So would you describe your drinking and using problematic at this point, or not really?
So I think that, I mean, I thought that it wasn't problematic, but I can reflect now, when I was only drinking, you know, and I go through a spell of like, right, okay, I've been partying too much, but the drinking kind of remained. I remember having a sit down, like a sort of semi-intervention with a lot of my really close friends, and they said, like, you know, they sat me down and said, look, when we're chilling, just don't drink, because you seem to just drink a little bit too much and we're not drinking. And I tried to explain to them, I said, like, I don't know what it is, but I have this physical need. Like, when I have one, all bets, like, I will write off the next day, I need to have another one. And it's not that I don't like being around you, but I need to then, and they didn't quite understand it. And it's only now that I realize, you know, they're not, how could you, you know, we as non-alcoholics, you know, and I wasn't even labeled an alcoholic at the time, but we can drink and we can put it down. So why can't you? What is the, you know, you can see that we're telling you it's destroying your life. So my solution to that was to, well, just drink in my room then. You know, you can't complain if I'm not there. And it's, I remember that was the first time, now that I look back on it, that actually, you know, they wanted me there. You know, it's not that it's not that they didn't want me there. It's that they wanted me there, but they wanted me sober, because that's the person that I was. You know, the drugs kind of, you know, enabled me to drink more and not be too much of a knobhead, really. But that was the first time. And I think as I, you know, when I 24, 25, when people started to finish uni, and people started to move away, and you know, that's when I think it really, you know, that's when it really started to look like I had a problem, because everyone was growing up and I wasn't, and I didn't want to grow up.
Before we go there, what I think is interesting to maybe delve into just for a second is, you know, when we're speaking about the good times and the parties and all of that. One, you know, awareness klaxon, you know, did you have any clue of what was going on in terms of what drugs or alcohol were doing with you that you couldn't do for yourself? Let's start with that. Did you have any awareness at all, or none whatsoever? You're just having a good time?
Interesting. It's something that we always did. You know, I hung around with a group, different groups, where it was very commonplace. I think the early signs were really alcohol, when I would say that I'm only drinking because I can't sleep. You know, that I was actually starting to use this as a way, but which was completely false, because I'd be up until 4 o'clock in the morning still drinking, you know.
By yourself?
I'd say, yeah, exactly, because everyone's gone to bed. You know, so those alcohol really was for me, because it was readily available. And I think if I can look back now and there was any sign that I was using not in a sociable setting, it would be that.
music is one of the great joys of life, undoubtedly, and yet often we use drugs to enhance our experience of it, as if music doesn't need it. But I didn't really understand that then, And you then studied music as well. How did those two things, music and drugs, how did they interact with each other? How did you find that you maybe needed one for the other? How were they related to one another? Because I think that is the experience for a lot of people, and especially when you're growing up and you're in your 20s or in your late teens, that those things kind of belong together. How did you experience that? Talk to us about that.
Well, it was sort of, obviously studying music, particularly at college, you learn, it was called music in context. So it's the history kind of music. And you sort of realize that actually, particularly in the last sort of century, that drugs influence music. You've got, the 60s and psychedelia.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the 70s, and then, kind of the 80s, and drugs that were introduced. For me at that time, it was particularly, raves were quite, it was just post jungle era, but it was drum and bass, and it was pills and MDMA. And it was, funnily enough, it was ketamine had kind of started to become quite well known. And I can remember my housemate came in, and he at the time, and he said, look, you like drum and bass, and you like reggae? And I was like, yeah, which, weed and pills. And I said, yeah. And he goes, have you heard this thing called dubstep? And I was like, no. I listened to it, and I thought, this is awful. This is terrible. What is this? And it was a Scream album. And I can remember being there's a club called Volks in Brighton, and Scream was there at the bar, basically. And this was way before he was famous. I remember having this debate. I was a massive drum and bass head. I'd had a few, a bit to drink, so I was a bit of a knothead. I was quite, I was still with it. But I remember saying to him, and my housemate was just really embarrassed. And I said, this dubstep thing will never take off. And I remember that to this day, but also kind of like seeing that was the beginning for me of seeing how ketamine within my friends, and I loved ketamine, if I'm honest. I had to give it up quite quickly because I saw how it just ripped through people. But just kind of making that connection of, when I smoke weed, I want to listen to reggae. When I take pills, I want to listen to drum and bass. When I take ketamine, I can tolerate, let's just say, dubstep, side trance, that kind of stuff. I had friends that liked all sorts of different music, and it wasn't like, I didn't want to come across like I was egotistical, because I truly do believe that any genre of music, we will find a song that we will like in. And I remember having a really heated discussion with someone that was massive, was a metalhead at college, and he was just like, I'm only going to write metal. There's no other genre. Dance music is terrible, and you can't have one song that I will like that isn't metal. And I said, Fatboy Slim praise you. And he went, fair enough, you got me. Yeah. But it's so for me, it plays a massive part, and it's just through history. You see the different bands through the decades, and you look at the drugs that were prevalent at the time.
The fact that a lot of musicians, obviously, belong to us, to our group, and are one of us, so to speak, and that the music is influenced by that, I think clearly makes a big difference. Of course, we look up to those people in many ways, and, especially when we're a bit younger, maybe, and that gives us another reason, to think that it's okay to go all out. I think, it's an interesting thing to consider. I certainly never liked any kind of electronic music before. I didn't find ecstasy and amphetamines, basically. Before that, I was never really much interested. It only made sense to me, once I had my first few pills. That's when I was like, all right, now I get the house music thing. Duh. Right, yeah, okay. And it gets you into some sort of trance, and then, and all of that. But without it, I could never really enjoy it much. So maybe it's not really who I really am in terms of music. Question 3 is, what were your worst consequences? And finally, your rock bottom. Now, this might stretch over quite a little bit of time, of course, depending on how long you were out there for and a serious drinker and user. But talk to us about the progression of your illness.
I mean, if I look back at the consequences, you know, the fact that even from when I first started using, you know, I didn't put any effort into my college work. You know, I did all right at school, but it really got me in college, and I really didn't, you know, it set me on a course, you know, so I could sort of say that was a consequence of that. And I think even when I was studying music, it wasn't really, you know, I think if I think back to the worst consequences, or that I feel I look back on, it's usually losing friends and losing people from my life because I chose, and I didn't see it at the time, but I chose drugs and alcohol over them. I thought they were the problem, and I wasn't the problem.
How would that manifest then? I mean, you've already had like a mini intervention, you know, at quite an early age, I suppose, by your friends saying, look, we're just chilling out here and you're really getting hammered, you know, what's that about? And you really have to do this. But how would this manifest? Would you exclude people who didn't drink or use the way you did? Or was it a way just of isolating? How did it manifest?
So I was, so it was mainly alcohol. It would be that, I mean, it's funny that alcohol was the one that stuck around, but it was by far the one that made me the worst version of myself. I mean, I would argue, you know, when people say, oh, I'm funny on alcohol, I'm this, I'm like, well, I would argue that you're probably not the best version of yourself. But I would be super chatty, super annoying. But then there would be this, you know, I was the Jekyll and Hyde, you know, I'd wake up in the morning and have a complete blackout. But I'd have this feeling of like, okay, well, I know I've done something, or I've still got some rage sort of left in me. And, you know, and then I have to speak to people. Usually I don't want to, you know, turn my phone off, but I can remember speaking to people, and just that kind of like, they tell me what I've done.
Mm-hmm.
And when I apologize, it's like, it feels so hollow because I don't necessarily know really what I've done. You know, they tell me these things, but I don't know the gravity. You know, someone tells you what you've done, but it's a summary of, you know, you've been out there for a few hours. Do you know what I mean? That all of this stuff has happened. And it's, and I felt over time that kind of, I kept saying sorry for things that I didn't even really know. And it didn't, I kept doing it to people. You know, I kept drinking far too much and blacking out, and, you know, and waking up saying, oh, you know, you had an argument with so-and-so, or, you know, you're really, you know, my anger really manifested. You know, I became that Mr. Hyde.
I think being angry when you're drunk is a really, really common thing to happen. So not everybody gets that or gets it reliably, so to speak. You know, there is the sort of person who just kind of get a bit soppy and overly emotional when they're drunk and sort of happy, that kind of thing, you know. But there is the person, and is almost an archetype, I suppose, of the angry drunk, you know, the ugly drunk. And I think that's something that a lot of people will be able to relate to, you know. I find it interesting that you would wake up from a blackout with rage still in you. That's quite telling.
I had, so the reason, so there was another, you know, I was thinking back to one specific time actually, and one of the big consequences was perhaps not necessarily the fact that I split up with my the mother of my child, but the way in which the whole thing happened and what I put her through is a real regret. That even though I've done my step 9 with her, even though, you know, I've been sober for a while and we have a good relationship now, I still regret. I remember waking up not knowing, you know, just sort of coming to, but really feeling this rage still there. And I came downstairs, and and what had happened was I'd been to the pub, and I'd come back, and I was in blackout, and I was just verbally abusive for no real reason, you know. I realised now that I had a lot of that anger that I suppressed when I was sober came out when I was drinking. It didn't come out on other drugs, but it did come out when I was drinking. And I remember sitting there thinking, right, okay, well, that's it. I remember sitting there thinking, if I still got anger now, I still feel that tension now, I must have been awful. And that was what, I was never physically abusive with her or anyone I've been with, but I now see emotionally and verbally. And part of that is I thought that it was normal. I grew up and shouting was, arguments and shouting. In fact, it wasn't until I was in rehab, I was, at 32 years old, that the counsellor says that there is a difference between anger and aggression. I thought they were the same thing. That it's okay to be angry, but it's not okay to be aggressive. And I didn't realise. I thought, wow, that was such a light bulb moment. And I remember telling my son that, the difference between you. I think he was 6 years old. I don't understand. I said, don't worry, I didn't understand until I was 32. You're all right. But it's okay to be angry.
It's a really important distinction to make, of course. And in one of those, I suppose that, if you just hear it, you kind of go, oh, yeah. But then if it is a deep realization of a behavior that you were never really able to get your head around, then it can be really profound. Yeah.
But it was, I remember hearing that and thinking, right, okay, because I just thought angry meant you shout, and we have this shouting match until one of us submits, I guess, is the, I think back to it now, it's crazy, but that's how I thought,
So you became this angry drunk, basically, in a nutshell, and it took away friendships. It, by the sound of it, contributed to the separation from the mother of your child. How else did it manifest, and how did it get worse?
I became very isolated towards the end. I thought I was, I think it went back to, this must be a me problem, but I'm better off without them anyway. I'm all right. And I would, I thought that was a part of getting older, that you lose friends and you have some cool sort of people. But I can remember, particularly towards the end, I went to pubs that I knew where people were, the people that if they stopped, they would die, because that justified my drinking. I thought, well, I'm not as bad as them, so I can't be an alcoholic. But it meant that I was just so isolated, and I was comfortable in the misery, and I thought that, I was once, when I was I thought I was an extrovert that become an introvert. That's what I thought. I thought I'd just grown up, and I just thought that, this is how life was.
You just said something there that really reminded me of the last 2 years or so of my using, being comfortable in one's misery. It's a really interesting stage, that I think a plateau stage for me, right? Where you're not really, you're pretty bad, but you've plateaued for a little while. I would always go, there'd be an acceleration, where I would do things that I didn't do before, right? Like stay up yet another night longer on a binge, or, binge 3 times within 1 week or something like that, right? And I would have another, I never used to do this, but I do this thing now apparently, right? And then I would plateau there for quite some time. And then actually the progression was, that time was getting shorter and shorter, and the progression was getting faster as well. So not only was I getting worse, but also I was getting worse faster, if that makes sense. But in all of that, there were those periods, and they could go on for quite a few months, where I was just that comfortable in my misery. I knew my life wasn't great. I knew I had some sort of a problem, that I had the illusion that I was still somehow in control of it, right? But I knew that I was really miserable. In my heart of hearts, I was really miserable, and I was quite comfortable there. And I think it's a feature of our illness in some ways, that we just accept this and kind of go, and yeah, well, that's just me then, or that's the way life is, or that's the way getting older is, which of course is laughable because you went into rehab at 32, so clearly not actually old. I just wanted to point this out. Being comfortable in one's misery is something that I think comes along with the progression in a weird sort of way.
If you're enjoying this podcast and would like other addicts and alcoholics to hear it, then please make the pesky AIs and algorithms work their 12th step. Hit like and subscribe.
It's I got told actually in rehab by a counsellor, and I haven't fact checked this, but he said that when they opened the door to Auschwitz, the people inside didn't want to come out because the misery that they knew inside was a known evil. They didn't know what was on the outside. And whether that's true or not, I take that as sometimes it's easier for me to sit in the comfortability of my anger and isolate. Even in recovery, it's got less and less recently, the more, and I think that's part of the reason why sometimes we don't want to go to meetings, because it's easier to sit and watch Netflix, even though I've got this, I'm not in any danger of relapsing, but I'm irritable. And it's easier than to put any effort in, I guess.
Yeah, there is a lot of that. And I think probably slightly beyond the scope of this podcast to really delve further into it, because I want to get to know how you ended up then in the rooms and how you rock bottom, if you had one, how that came about. But there is a lot in this area here, I think, of feeling comfortable in one's misery, being acceptant of it, but somehow it not being bad enough to spring you into action. And I think a lot of middle of the road recovery happens there, and a lot of, well, I'm kind of bad with my drinking and using, but not that bad that I need to go and look for help, happens in that grey area there that is so difficult to define, clearly because we've been mumbling about it for like a couple of minutes now.
One thing that I will say is that I heard about something called the region beta paradox. And it's the idea that if you were to go 1 mile, you'd walk. That if you were to go 2 miles, you'd either cycle or drive. So in theory, you'd get to 2 miles quicker than you would 1 mile. So sometimes in life, it's better to be in a worse position, because that will propel you to progress faster than you would, than just being comfortably numb, I guess.
Yeah. I suppose it sort of it is what happens before we get the gift of desperation, I suppose. And that is also, I suppose, why it's called a gift. It's really interesting. Thank you for that. How did it then come about that you are in that space, in that grey zone, in that grey misery, right, where you're not quite bad enough to really do something about it, but you're in a bad space? How did you get to the gift of desperation?
So it's we talk about the yets, and so it wasn't. I thought that it might have been my rock bottom, because I kind of got sober for a little bit. But I split up with my ex-partner. I'd moved from Brighton to Somerset because I couldn't afford the rent, and obviously we had a mortgage. And I was driving quite a lot to see my son. And over the course of sort of a few years, I remember thinking I'd never drink and drive on that long journey. There's a difference between going to the pub and having a couple and driving down the lanes, and then, being drunk and driving to, 4 hours to Brighton. And I can remember the thought came into my head that there's a supermarket on the way. There's about half an hour outside of Brighton. I'll stop there and I'll buy a 4-pack, and I'll drink one in that space of time, because technically I wouldn't be over the limit. Fast forward a year, and I'm picking up a 4-pack before I'd even left Taunton, and this became a regular occurrence on both ways. I was able to stay sober. And this is one of the reasons, why I see my son as a gift. I didn't get sober for him, but he definitely stopped me from going too far. I was able to, even though I spent most of my time hungover around him, I was able to, hold it together somewhat when I was with him. And I remember it got to a point where that was happening, but at the same time, COVID hit. And I ended up moving in with my mum. I had a business that I was trying to get off the ground. And we finally had, this client that we were going to get, and it was going to be, but this, I look back now and I think I'm so glad that never happened. It's blessings in disguise. I couldn't see it at the time. And it didn't happen because, COVID had happened, and it was, the client was Ticketmaster, and they were the last people. But, they were like, we've got enough going on than to,
Yeah.
So I ended up moving in with my mum because I wanted to save money. And also, and I remember it was such a really weird time. I didn't know whether I was, I didn't know. I didn't go and see my son for about 4.5 weeks. And because, I was living in Somerset, the rules around this were kind of like, we didn't know, this pre-bubble, this was, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, this was like, when we all thought it was just, going to be a little holiday. And I can remember, I didn't at this point think I was an addict. I knew I had a problem, but I didn't think I was an addict. And I'd got into really probably since September the previous year, I went down the rabbit hole with some conspiracies. Started off with Jeffrey Epstein, and obviously this all kicked things off. We talk about being comfortable in the misery, and I was miserable, so I wanted to surround myself with, things. It almost kind of made me feel a little bit, right, okay, and if I'm feeling this miserable, there's other people out there, and there's things that are happening. And I kind of got to a place of like, I don't know what's true and what's not, but there's enough that we all know about in society that we would deem as evil. We're talking sex trafficking, paedophilia, all of this stuff. Where I came to this point of like, there has to be another side to this. I was a 99% atheist, 1% agnostic, but I got to a point where I was just like this, I'd had a couple of friends that talked about God. And I had this, I thought, right, God, if you're out there, give me a sign. That's where I came to. I said, right, if, this can't be all, there has to be some kind of hope, because it felt like with COVID happening, all of this stuff, this fear, I didn't know what was going to happen, what was going to happen. And I remember looking at a star outside my window, and I thought, right, if God's there, he'll just show me a sign or give me a shooting star. And nothing happened. And I was in, and I thought, right, this is absolutely ridiculous. And about 2 hours later, I was sitting in my room, and suddenly I just had this feeling that I've never had before in my life. And I've never had it since. I describe it as kind of like a fuzzy feeling, but it wasn't. It lasted for about a second and a half. And suddenly I was like, right, okay, there is something here. And the preceding couple of months, or about a week later, I heard the gospel, and that kind of began to formulate my higher power. And what that suddenly did was it shined a real light on everything, and my consequences came very thick and fast, to the point that within the space of a month or two, I think it was probably about a month and a half, I'd gone from not thinking I had a problem to crashing my car in the middle of the night, looking at it thinking, how have I not killed anyone? I've been doing this for a long time. I couldn't stop because I kept trying to stop. I knew it was wrong at this point. I knew after having the spiritual experience that driving this car drunk, I'm going to kill someone. I couldn't stop doing it. And not only was I in a place of defeat, that was my rock bottom, but in the background, my dad had actually called a rehab a few days before. So not only had I reached this place, had there been a place for me at rehab, but I'd reached a point I was willing to accept it. If that had happened any other way. So that was my rock bottom. That was kind of, and it was even to the point at which, it was only going to be 4 weeks. So for me, it was kind of like my rock bottom happened. It wasn't I didn't lose everything. I wasn't homeless. I wasn't that, I wasn't that kind of that park bench drunk, although I could very well have been. And I'm grateful that, a rock bottom is when you decide it's over, when you've had enough, and I had.
Yeah, that's right.
So that was mine.
Yeah, there's so much in that. I find, so first of all, I'm ashamed to say that I did some drug driving, which I deeply regret, and thankfully I nothing happened. Remember also waking up from blackouts, whereby I'd be thinking, where's the car? What have I done? Is the dog safe? All of that, and I wouldn't know whether I'd been driving or not and all the rest of it. So, the fact that I was clearly a danger onto myself and others really helped me with that gift of desperation, with going to go and look, something awful is about to happen here unless I do something, and wanting help and then accepting help, right? It was a really deeply distressing thing to happen on the one hand, and on the other hand, something incredibly helpful, because it made me realize that the true state of me at that time. And I want to stress, obviously, that there is no, just because you said this earlier, there is no safe limit for drunk driving or anything like that. We don't condone any drunk or drug driving on this pod. I think we'd all be lying to ourselves, if we did. So if you're listening to this pod and you're driving, please stay sober. But it is important also, as I said, to realize that this is a real feature of our illnesses, that we end up doing things that we would never really want to do, and it's part of getting to that rock bottom is seeing those things, those yets coming true. So thank you for sharing that. Our question 4 is, at your worst, did you ever want to die? Did you consider suicide?
Yes. In fact, suicide has kind of been a part of my story since I can really remember. But I used it in a way that was kind of like a drug, I guess. It was in a sense that when I thought about it, it gave me some kind of relief and a justification for things that had happened or my actions. I kind of thought, well, worst case scenario, I can always kill myself. When the head, when I was waking up in the morning and I just felt absolutely miserable, it felt like, well, there's always that way out. I've always got that option, so it's okay. So that kind of helped me to sort of, I guess, process and I don't want to say forgive myself, but just sort of move on from things. That there's always this get out that I can use, and whilst it wasn't the rock bottom that finally got me sober, there was certainly a rock bottom that first got me into the rooms, and that was, I say to myself that the reason that I didn't do it was because I wanted to do it in such a way that my ex would get the insurance money, because if I'd have killed myself, it wasn't on the insurance. But if I'm being really honest, I don't think I ever had the guts to do it, which is such a horrible place to live, where you really want to do it, but you don't have the guts. You're living in this kind of pain. It's just not nice.
As much as I'd like to think that it's, and know from my own experience that it's not great to live in pain and live in that place, I'm also really glad that place is there, because otherwise, a lot more of us would end up not being here. So it's not sure if I can pass judgment on that place, on that space. I am glad that I didn't have the guts to do it. So, and I'm also wondering whether we should even express it as such, the guts to do it. I think it's a desperation rather than guts,
True. Yeah, very true. It's not a courageous act at all. It's and I'm truly glad as well that we, and it's that place that actually gets us into the roots. Sometimes we have to experience that in order to, okay, well, I can't do that. So what's the, what other solution is there?
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. It's it's sort of on the back of what we're saying about the gift of desperation, and experiencing that desperation. Now, our question 5. What other methods did you try to get sober before finding the rooms? Or did you? Did you try anything?
Therapy. What I realized actually now, looking back on it, is a lot of the reasons that I did these things wasn't for me, it was for other people. Other people, particularly my ex. I started therapy and I had a therapist for 2 years. We did unit counting. I did, just little tricks. Like when I went out, I'd have water in between pints or between my drinks. I wouldn't take my wallet out with me in case I walked past a pub. all of these little kind of things, they didn't really work. It was just. But I realised now it was for other people. Because I still didn't think I had a problem. I still didn't. I didn't have to experience me, because I experienced me through. Other people experienced me through blackout. But I didn't have to experience that. I didn't have to experience that high. So I didn't realise I had a problem. But everyone else around me was saying, like, They didn't even use the word alcoholic. They said, you've got an alcohol problem, because I didn't drink I didn't drink every day. I was a binge drinker. But I spent my entire life hungover, so.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar, that one. Isn't it interesting? I sometimes wonder whether those things really do work with people who actually have a problem with alcohol, not taking your wallet out and all the other bits and pieces that you said there, if that ever really stopped anyone at all. It'd be interesting to speak to sober curious people rather than to alcoholics like us, to find out, just as an aside. It would be interesting. So you did it for other people, in other words. You tried to, because you're obviously trying to appease others, trying to appease your then partner, but you didn't really want to stop, is what I'm hearing. Because you didn't really think that you had a problem.
No, I didn't. I mean, I certainly didn't think abstinence was the answer.
What's the answer? Yeah,
and it never even entered my head. I just wanted to learn how to drink and use in a normal way, like everyone else, And I don't even think my partner necessarily thought that I should stop drinking, because she was a drinker, but nowhere near to the extent that I was. I still find it fascinating how she can have half a glass of wine and leave it on the side.
No, I will never understand that.
And and I can remember at one point eyeing it up, and she said, "Don't you finish that?" And I'm like, "Why? Why?" But it was just a way to. It was just figuring out how I could drink normally, like other people, and not make a tit of myself, I guess.
You just said very quickly and slightly off script. You just said, not that it makes a difference, but still, you said drink, and then you added use into it. Did the using also increased along with your drinking? Did you? Was cocaine another way for you to just drink more, or how did it play out for you, just very quickly?
So there were people that I would go out and drink with and socialize with, and then there were people that I would use with. And
right.
The people that I would use with were the people, and I would use in such a way that I would when I was in my early 20s. And it was a case of, if there were the people that would get the coke out, would get the MDMA out, were the people that I would still be up with for the whole weekend. And I can remember that a festival that we went to, and my partner was pregnant. I went and hung around with a group of people that were mutual friends of us, and she was asleep in the tent, and I never came back. And I think it was kind of where I'm sort of going with that, is that I would always want to go where the party is. So if I started using, I'd want to stay there until either the sun came up, or, even though I had responsibilities. So, and it would be the same with drinking as well.
Question 6, you've come into the rooms, you've experienced the gift of desperation. You crashed your car, you know that something is deeply wrong with you, and that you've got a problem that needs sorting out. So you've come into the rooms. Question 6, when you did you struggle with the word God? I mean, you did say that you were, if I can quote you here, 99% atheist and 1% agnostic, which is a very interesting mixture there. So how did that play out?
Yeah, and I say that because I joke, and it was, I read the book The God Delusion when I was on holiday in Kenya. So I was surrounded by this beauty. Yeah, I'm so focused on how God can't be real. And in the book, Richard Dawkins says, you can't really ever be truly atheist because we still don't know the answer. So I would call myself 99% atheist, 1% agnostic. So it's kind of like, I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but I'm still open-minded, when in fact I wasn't open-minded at all.
I love that. It's a wonderful proof of openness.
Yeah, I know, it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, brilliant.
When I first came into the rooms, before crashing my car, my first rock bottom, I came in because a therapist told me to. I had a deep resentment against that therapist because I came back, I paid him £70, and within 10 minutes he said I should go to AA, which I thought, you're just fobbing me off to someone else now. And I remember sitting in the...
Good job by the therapist, though.
Definitely. But, I wasn't ready. I was not ready at all. I still didn't think I had a problem. This was 2 or 3 years before I actually ended up going to rehab. And I can remember going into that meeting. First of all, it was a candlelit meeting. So it was already a bit kind of like, right, okay, cultish. But I sat and listened, and I did relate to some of the stories, but I can remember what really turned me off. And it was someone saying that they're grateful to be an alcoholic. And I thought, right, you're a liar. And I looked at the steps and I thought, how is that? All I want to do is stop drinking, or what I thought was drink normally. I just want to drink with a normal person. But these people are, and I thought they were lying. I thought we're sitting in here in candlelight. And as I said, I'm 99% atheist, 1% agnostic. So I'm just like, this is, this spiritual thing is just absolute nonsense. So yeah, I did have a problem with the word God. I didn't understand how that was going to help me. And in fact, I remember during that time, I went to about 3 or 4 meetings. I went to another meeting, and I remember outside, someone said, oh, it's a higher power. It can be whatever you want it to be. It could even be a vacuum. So I went back and I looked at my vacuum, and I just didn't get it. I thought, I can break you. Yes, it was kind of like, it was like, this really is just, this isn't going to help me, And at that point, I wasn't managing my drinking, but my life had got a bit better because I'd been sober a little bit longer. I'd started to exercise. I listened to the doctor and started taking antidepressants, and it was my therapist who was clearly wrong that said I needed AA. So,
And now question 7, how do you experience your higher power today? Now, after being 99% atheist and 1% agnostic, in your wonderful open-mindedness, how being sober for a while and being a member of the fellowship and having done your steps and so on, how do you experience your higher power today? How's that changed?
how I experience it today is through others. When I first came in, I was very kind of like, right, I've got God. I didn't know what God's will meant. I didn't know where my self-will stopped and God's will started. And I remember just being really kind of like, I am a child, please make it obvious, and please give me the wisdom and make it obvious what you want me to do. And I remember there being really big changes and really big swings. And but now it's, God shows small signs through different things just to let me know that he's there. Because generally I kind of know after some time what's right and what's wrong. Generally speaking, I have that kind of, through experience, I kind of know what the next right decision should be. And sometimes when I say, what is your will? A lot of times I don't get much back. And that's because of the question I'm asking is, right, I'm thinking about something too far into the future. It's not the right question. I'll tell you later. But I see it through other people now. I see when people come in and they have that desperate brokenness, and within the space of a few months, they're just shocked at how quickly their life has changed. They thought they'd never see their children again, yet now they've got access, supervised access, or just family members starting to accept them when they thought that they would never, they were completely cut off, or just, and material things that have happened that and things that have been looming over someone's head, and because that they put their all into the work or into the fact, or just coming to meetings and just staying sober, which in the beginning is just, that's it, just that's the one thing.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's how I see now. But there's other, like even today, like a couple of songs came on the radio that I was listening to when I was outside that reminded me of my uni days, and remembering and bringing up all of these, because I knew that I was coming on this podcast. I knew that would probably come up, and it was just kind of like a little nod to kind of like, look how far you've come, and look how you can still appreciate it.
Yeah. I remember going to a Bob D workshop, and I love Bob D, who, because of he's a great storyteller, and his wisdom is just amazing. And he said this thing which really stuck with me, that it's really difficult to see God's work in your own life, because, as he put it, he's very old and it takes a long time for things to appear. But if you really want to see it more easily, you can always see it in others. And that is exactly what you said. You're totally right. People come into the rooms and they look terrible. They're hunched over. They're just desperate. They don't know where to turn. They're off. Everybody comes into the rooms with big drama and, oh my God, this is the end of the world. That's, if you don't come into the rooms this way, chances are you think we're a bit funny, and at the same time, and then you might not just go to that particular meeting for a while, or you're away on holiday or something like that. You come back and that same person, you're like, wow, look at them. They look so different. They're changed people. Their skin looks better. They're glowing. They look well. They speak differently. And it's so much easier to see the transformation in others than it is to see it in ourselves. So it's something that I can really relate to. Absolutely. Our question 8, which parts of the steps were the most difficult for you?
Difficult by far was step 9. And it wasn't all of step 9. It was, in fact, it's what's stopped me from really growing. And I had a big pause for a long time. It was a step 9 with a particular person. And it says in the book, doesn't it, that, to not... Even if someone has done worse to you than you did to them, that we're not to criticize, that we're to stay silent and kind of let them. And it's and I did that, and I remember coming out feeling that rage again. And I think it was at a similar time where there were some other people that I had reached out to, and they'd almost sort of said, "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. It's absolutely fine. I think you're overthinking this." And I thought, not that I ever said that I wouldn't do it, but I just kind of. I couldn't get over that anger, and it was something actually that has been really hard for me, if I'm honest, that, this whole kind of keeping my side of the street clean. What about your side? Your side. If I'm doing mine, you should do yours. And it's, I think that by far was the hardest one, because it really stopped me from seeing the beauty in it, really. I've finally did a step 9 with my partner, because I always thought that my living amends was going to be being there for my son and always being there for her, whenever she needed help. And we have had a good relationship. We've had arguments over the years, but it was only when I sort of doing it again and coming to a step 9, and I sat down with her. And she said, you've never said sorry. And I was like, wow. And I didn't, and it was a realization that the way in which we communicate was she needs words of kind of affirmation to say that she's doing a good job, and for me to communicate in that way, whereas I don't necessarily do that. I try to communicate through actions. And being able to, I always thought that when she wanted me to feel how hard it was for her, what she was looking for was just to say, well, you're doing an amazing job. But I saw that as, I just got in defense mode. And like, well, I'm doing all of this, I'm trying, I've got all of this to manage. And it was, but one of the things that I didn't realize would happen was I kind of had this, when we had this, the step 9, which actually was only recently, and it was, I suddenly had this guilt that had gone, because I was doing all of these actions because I felt like I had to. So when the next week with my son, we made a card and we wrote down all the things that we're grateful for about her. And we gave it to her. And for the first time I did that act because I wanted to, not because I felt like I had to. And that's just a difference that I felt that I wouldn't have even thought of with the step 9. It wasn't, I can forgive myself, but not having that guilt. Step 4, I think, was long. I really procrastinated on it because, I can remember my sponsor saying to me, because when I first got sober, I was fixating on everything. It was, as we do, food, I'd justify everything, not just with, romantically, but also fixating and resenting on other people, anything to not do. And it was around about, I think it was about 10 months sober, and NFTs and crypto had just sort of blown up. And that to me was just kind of like, and I remember him saying on the phone, he said, "Luke, I think you'd feel a little bit better if you'd get stuck into your step work and do more meetings rather than hang out with Pepe and friends on the internet." And I'm like, yeah, but these pictures, because it was this world, it's this fantasy that I look at speaking
the NFT craze, I remember it.
So it was kind of like communicating in gifts with all these people around the world, and this was my little community. So I haven't really made it hard on myself. So I haven't made it easy on myself. So my step 4 was really long and drawn out, and perhaps I overthought it, but I did want it to be thorough. But those two, I think those are the big ones, aren't they? Really.
Step 9. Question 9 even. Which character defects give you most trouble?
I probably was
NFTs, clearly.
But shiny objects, my attention to, I remember saying that I had, to my counsellor at the time, I said that I was allergic to anything that's good for me. But definitely pride. It still plays a big role in, doing my step 4 again. It's still there. And also wrath, although it's manifested itself slightly differently, but definitely, the aggression side of anger. Whereas it wouldn't, when I was in addiction, it would manifest in more openly overt ways. Now it's still there, but it's covert. There's things that I won't sort of say, but I kind of will just sort of like, right, okay, well, I'm just going to cut you off in there, in a sense of,
Yeah.
But yeah, those two things, definitely.
Question 10. What's the best thing recovery has given you?
I was going to say NFTs, but no. There's a lot of, material things that I could name. I'm earning more than I've ever earned on a salaried role, and I've got so many opportunities, and I've got a really great relationship with my son, and I'm present for him. But really, things like I've got hope, which I never had before, which and that comes through faith. When I take it for granted having a God of my understanding that I know that's going to look out for me. And there's just this kind of safety net there, which I never could have had before. And I do take it for granted sometimes. But actually, just the knowledge that everything's going to be okay. If I do these things, and sometimes I don't, sometimes I kind of think I don't necessarily need it. But, my experience has shown me the more that I put into recovery, everything else sorts itself out. And also I just feel generally happier. Patience as well. I still don't have a huge amount of it, but patience matched with consistency and acceptance is kind of like my perfect, and that's not to say I do it every day. And that's not to say that, I am those things, but that for me, I can see now, particularly over the last couple of years, that when I do practice patience and consistency, that generally things get to, in all aspects, whether that be in a relationship with friends, with recovery, with my job. And then if I match that with gratitude, it does eventually kind of bring me peace. And that's something that I'm now learning that I should be seeking more, making decisions that bring me peace rather than what I used to do, which is just seeking pleasure or seeking some kind of quick fix.
It's interesting. I really liked what you said. that you do mention the material bits, and it's interesting because, of course, just by the sheer fact of staying sober, right, we give ourselves every chance in the world for things to repair and repair themselves almost, right? So if you stay sober for long enough, then chances are, things at your job are going to get better, or you're going to find another job, and, the relationships will mend because you don't misbehave all the time and things. But and those things, they can come about fairly quickly in a fairly short amount of time. But all the other things that you said, the things inside, patience, acceptance, and consistency, and all those things, they are gifts that we're being given, and that are worth, in a funny way, they are worth so much more, of course. But it's interesting that you mentioned both, and really lovely answer. Thank you. Question 11. What would you say to a newcomer or someone wondering if they're an addict?
I would say get a sponsor before you lose the gift of desperation. Because I didn't make it easy on myself when I first came in. As previously mentioned, I will kind of do it. When I had the drugs and alcohol taken away and I first come out of rehab, I thought that I was fixed. I thought I was a new person, but it took 2 weeks to realize that I wasn't really. I was the same person. And thankfully, the person who became my sponsor said, "Why don't you come to a meeting?" And back then, it was very easy. Well, it was, it was COVID times. And I remember walking to my first meeting after rehab, and there were 4 people in the room and 20 people on this TV. And we all had masks. And it was all a bit weird. And I take that away, I will want to fixate on anything because, I'm used to escaping. And whether that be going down a suicide route or whether that be eating too much food, I wanted to fix my feelings, or whether that be resenting someone, or whether that be seeking someone. I didn't understand what was the problem was inside. And if it wasn't for a sponsor, because I had some pretty wacky ideas, and that's not to say that I did everything my sponsor suggested, but to have someone there just to run things through and just to speak and to hold you accountable, during that, and you said before when we first come in, we've got all of these big dramas and everything is just up in the air. We didn't come in because our life was great, and to navigate that, I think is really important. So obviously the suggestions are get a sponsor, get service, and do the steps. But I would say just get a sponsor first, just as quickly as possible. It doesn't have to be your forever sponsor, but it's just someone that you can speak to on a regular basis, that you can check in with, that can keep holding you accountable, maybe give you a perspective that you haven't thought of. Because I will naturally, and even to an extent now, will do things that I think are beneficial to me, but actually in the long term probably aren't. And if I'm grateful that I've got God, that especially when it comes around people, that people kind of enter my life and don't, and I can quite quickly, I can. Especially when I was in the beginning, it was kind of like God let me go down a certain path, but okay, enough's enough now. I'm going to take that person out of your life in quite a quick fashion. And it's kind of like, I feel that with a sponsor can also be a conduit of that as well. So that would be my advice, would be just to get a sponsor.
Yeah, I'd like to echo some of that. When I came into the rooms, I was aware that I needed to get on with this fairly quickly because I was intuitively aware that this window of opportunity that I had would shut fairly quickly. Just back on the basis of, if I looked back at my using, there were always a couple of weeks or so where I was able to put it down and not, and then feel really good, and then, go, I feel good enough now. I've got this, right? I've got control of this, and go right back. So I knew that I needed to do something, work the steps in that time. And at first I was a bit I was thinking like this, it had to be like a Mr. Miyagi kind of a sort of person, you know, sort of wax on, wax off, like some Asian dude with a long white beard who like sort of, he like a Zen master type thing who spoke with an echo, you know, Silvio, to the steps, you know. And it took a little while actually to get my head around the fact that all I needed was someone who had done the steps and who could take me through them, who was competent at this. And that it didn't have to be my best friend or anything like that, but just someone who's competent in the book and in the work, and that they were going to be able to take me through this and then for the rest to unfold. And thankfully I did, and thankfully I found the right person who was also just the right sponsor at the right time for me. You know, it was lovely. It was great. Wonderful. Question 12, our last question. What do you want your higher power to say to you at the pearly gates?
Welcome home, I think. And also, maybe not exactly this, but something like, you know, you fulfilled the purpose I had for you. I think that would be, I realise now that's kind of, you know, the top. You know, God's will, isn't it? You know, if I can achieve God's will you know, I'm not perfect, but you know, if I can get there and say, you know, you did it, not in your way, not mine, but you know, I think I'd be happy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Luke. I've really enjoyed talking to you today. It's been a really great hour and a bit more. We've thrown around some really interesting concepts. I'd like to reassure everybody that we're not sponsored by any NFT provider or anything like that.
I wouldn't recommend them, to be honest.
You know,
but yeah.
Well, there you have it. You know, and neither do I. We don't talk about outside. No position on outside issues, I think, is what applies here. But we, you know, really loved your honesty and the way you shared certain bits about how you turned from being 99% atheist and agnostic into someone who can speak openly and comfortably with the word God and higher power, and those areas that we talked about that I thought were really interesting about that grey zone before we finally get the gift of desperation. It was really, really strong, really enjoyable conversation with you today. Thank you for being my guest on 12 Steps and 12 Questions.
Thank you, Silvio.
We've come to the end of this episode. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed it and would like other addicts and alcoholics to hear it, then please make the pesky AIs and algorithms work their 12th step. Hit like and subscribe. While this pod is based on the 12-step recovery program, it's not officially affiliated with any 12-step fellowship. 12 Steps and 12 Questions is not substance or behavior specific, it's fully self-supporting and not-for-profit. And you know this next bit. It's not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization or institution. It does not wish to engage in any controversy, and it neither endorses nor opposes any causes.